Hey, what's up, Seekers? Welcome back. We are in the middle of a journey, tracing the history of the word mysticism, looking at what this term meant historically, what it means today, and what it might mean for us in the future. We're going to talk about competing methodologies in the study of mysticism, essentialism, perennialism, contextualism, constructivism. These terms, hopefully, by the end will all make sense to you. Exploring that crack between experience and interpretation, and questioning the very category of mysticism itself. Join us as we continue this story by talking about the debate that almost broke mysticism. The saga goes something like this. Ever since the 1400s in Italy during the Renaissance, with roots going all the way back to earlier Hellenic, Alexandrian, and Neoplatonic syncretisms, a way of thinking about philosophy and religion, and mysticism in particular, emerged. One which saw philosophical and religious traditions not as fundamentally opposed to one another, but rather as deeply compatible, and in fact, sharing the same basic truths. These shared truths, it was believed, could be discovered once the veneers of each seemingly opposing religion and philosophy were peeled away, revealing at their core a shared perennial truth that had come back and again to humanity through a long lineage of prophets, visionaries, sages, and mystics in each and every tradition. Naturally, it was specifically in the inner mystical sides of each religion where this meeting of hearts and minds was argued to have taken place. This line of thought, beginning or re-emerging in the 1400s with Gemistus Pletho, Marcello Ficino, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, among others, following a revival in interest in the mystical and esoteric accompanied by a translation effort of the corpora of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, which during the Renaissance gave birth to two distinct movements. One of them were the Christian Kabbalists, boasting such names as Johannes Reuchlin and Christian Kroer von Rosenkreuz, who sought to reinterpret Jewish mysticism through the prism of Christian theology and vice versa. The second movement, which was birthed, or rather rebirthed at that historical moment, which is more relevant to our current story, is the tradition of magnificent traditions, the philosophical school later coined by the humanist scholar and Vatican librarian Agostino Stucco as the Philosophia Perennis, or the perennial philosophy. The perennial philosophy which argued for this true philosophy which lay at the core of the world's religions, claiming prophets all the way back from Hermes Trismegistus, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, and Plato, and Moses, continued forward after the Renaissance, finding expression primarily among two camps. The first, which came to be known as the Traditionalists, with figures such as Rene Gunon, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Fridtjof Schuon, and later scholars like Syed Hossein Nasr and the great scholar of religion Huston Smith. What unites this somewhat diverse group of thinkers into the school of traditionalism is, to greater or less degrees, their shared belief in the transcendental unity of religions, namely the perennialist belief that all religions are united in their mystical core, along with affirming a sharp distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric, between the secret mystical and the revealed public aspects of religion, identifying the former as the true essence of religion. Another salient defining feature of the traditionalists, which for the record, for the sake of transparency, I'm no fan of, is their vitriolic anti-modernist tendencies, their outspoken decrying of what they saw as a crisis of modernity, and the need to return to tradition, mysticism, and Oriental metaphysics to avert the crisis. This final point of their theory, in my own experience, tinges their work with a pervasive and repugnant tone of disdain, hatred, and superiority, which in my own experience is in sharp and irreconcilable contrast with the best of mysticism, past and present, which carries a deep underlying tone not of hatred and antagonism, but of care and love. Mysticism without love, if it's even mysticism anymore, can lead to quite dark places, particularly when it's mixed with power as opposed to a desire to surrender. See the works of the traditionalist Julius Evola for an unfortunate example of where this thinking leads to. The second modern camp of perennialism that sought to find the inner universal unity lying behind all the diversity of religious phenomena spans a broad web of thinkers and movements between the Renaissance and the modern period, shaping while being shaped by the various conceptions of mysticism of its day, as we've begun to show. A rough outline of this amorphous school or tendency of thought, as it evolves throughout time, includes within its pages influential thinkers from the movements of German and English idealism and Romanticism, Cambridge Platonism, American Transcendentalism, and early modern occultism, with traceable influences from the human potential movement to Carl Jung and analytical, humanistic, and later transpersonal psychology, to the Theosophical Society at the hands of Blavatsky, Besant, and Hall, to the quantum theorists of the early 20th century, to Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, and Krishnamurti, Neo-Vedanta and Buddhist modernism, and the Beat Generation, to the religious ecumenicists like Murden, Fox, and Rohr, and the Neo-Hasidic movement, and later democratized, individualized, secularized, and capitalized upon by the New Age movements, and has even made its way into Hollywood and many more avenues of popular culture, eventually finding expression and articulation in a persuasive host of modern intellectuals and authors, from Christian Humphreys to D.T. Suzuki, Alan Watts, Carlos Castaneda, Joseph Campbell, and spilling over into the psychedelic renaissance of Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, and Richard Alpert, better known as Ram Dass. But the most influential advocate for the movement was probably Aldous Huxley, the British author, novelist, and public intellectual best known for his work Brave New World, who taught the world about perennialism through his publication of the best-selling The Perennial Philosophy in 1945, drawing on classic mystics from many of the world's mystical traditions, particularly from Neoplatonism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Advaita Vedanta, and Mahayana Buddhism. Huxley argued in his annotated anthology that the perennial philosophy reappears in all human cultures throughout history and is the essence of all religions. Rudiments of the perennial philosophy may be found among the traditional lore of primitive people in every religion of the world, and in its fully developed form, it has a place in every one of the higher religions, writes Huxley. Echoing James's famous words in his Varieties that we quoted earlier about the underlying doctrinal commonality and unanimity of mystical traditions, in mystic states we both become one with the Absolute, and we become aware of our oneness. This is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. In Hinduism, in Neoplatonism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Whitmanism, we find the same recurring note, so that there is about mystical utterances a eternal unanimity which ought to make a critic stop and think, and which brings it about that the mystical classics have, as has been said, neither birthday nor native land, perpetually telling of the unity of mankind with God. Their speech antedates language, and they do not grow old. This eternal utterance of the truth and unanimity of mysticism was confirmed for Huxley and millions more in the following decades in their own ethnogenically and psychedelically induced mystical experiences. Just as James had experimented with nitrous oxide, Huxley had with mescaline, which, as we mentioned earlier, precipitated his self-described experiences of the unfathomable mystery of pure being. Words like grace and transfiguration came to my mind, writes Huxley, the beatific vision, being, awareness, bliss. For the first time I understood, not on the verbal level, not by inchoate hints or at a distance, but precisely and completely what those prodigious symbols referred to. Here again we see the enduring influence of Schleiermacher and James's experiential turn upon the discourse of mysticism, the belief made explicit by Huxley that underlying mystical messages of all religions is the ability to discover the divine reality, the immanent and transcendent ground of all being, in the life, mind, and soul of the individual via an inner experience of the Absolute. And this experience was available to all humans at all times, a deep experience of unity which potentially could unite all of us. A powerful and vital message to be promoting amidst the ruins of 2 world wars, following the senseless deaths of millions of innocent souls at the hands of inexplicable hatred. A supreme antidote was needed. For authors like Huxley, it was precisely mysticism that provided that balm to a burning world. Among scholars of mysticism, this perennialist approach to mysticism came to be known as the Common-Core hypothesis, and found various degrees of support and expression in the comparative work of Friedrich Happold, William Wainwright, William Stace, Ninian Smart, and later in modified form in Philip Alman, Robert Foreman, and others. An extreme formulation of this position appears in the words of Happold. Not only have the mystics been found in all ages, in all parts of the world, and in all religious systems, but also mysticism has manifested itself in similar or identical forms wherever the mystical consciousness has been present. Almond identifies 5 different models or positions of varying degree among the Common-Core hypothesis, and Stutstill divvies up 5 versions of the perennialist hypothesis: 1 the phenomenological, 2 the doctrinal, 3 the epistemological, 4 the cognitive, and 5 the therapeutic or soteriological. But alas, this whole glorious structure came crushing down like a house of cards, at least insofar as academia was concerned. Discourse around mysticism in the public doesn't seem to care much for this cataclysm. It hasn't quite trickled its way through yet. There's been a lot of ink spilt on this latest development and controversy in the field of mysticism, a controversy and debate which pretty much brought the discourse to a standstill and impasse, one which is quite upsetting personally, and one which should have been resolved long ago, so I don't plan to dwell on it too long. I'll just share a broad sketch of it and leave those who are more interested with the resources to continue reading and learning for themselves. In 1978, an important collection of essays in the study of mysticism were collected and published by Stephen Katz under the title Mysticism and Philosophical Analysis, followed by a second volume in 1983 titled Mysticism and Religious Traditions. With his seminal essay, Language, Epistemology, and Mysticism, Katz makes a plea for the recognition of differences, with a sensitivity to the cultural particularity of mystics and the traditions that he finds lacking amongst the perennialists. Katz's analysis and deconstruction begins with a question that goes on to dominate the next 3 decades of scholarship. It is, what is the relationship between a mystical experience and its interpretation? And follows with what he deems to be an unquestionably basic epistemological principle, and the theoretical backbone of his hypothesis, namely, that it's impossible and incoherent to speak of a pure or unmediated experience. There simply is no such thing as an experience that is free from interpretation, according to Katz. Katz writes, the experience itself, as well as the form in which it is reported, is shaped by concepts which the mystic brings to and which shape his experience. The forms of consciousness which the mystic brings to experience set structured and limiting parameters on what the experience will be. This process of differentiation of mystical experiences into the patterns and symbols of established religious communities is experiential and does not take place in the post-experiential process of reporting and interpreting the experience itself. It is at work before, during, and after the experience. And again, writes Katz, all experience is processed through, organized by, and makes itself available to us in extremely complex epistemological ways. The perennialist and Common-Core hypothesis, according to Katz, therefore, can only be entertained on the naive assumption that an experience can be separated from its context. But once we realize that all experiences, including mystical experiences, are deeply conditioned by their socio-religious and cultural contexts, we have to dismiss the universalizing or essentializing attempts of the perennialists, as beautiful as they are. Katz brings our attention to the sheer diversity among mystical traditions, to what he sees as the rich, irreconcilable differences between them, and asks, once we recognize all of this difference and diversity, can we any longer in good faith refer to all these phenomena under one umbrella of mysticism? As McGinn puts it, while earlier ecumenically inclined philosophical and comparativist scholars, in their haste to find the common core of mysticism, downplayed the particularistic elements in mystical traditions, latching onto rare words and themes that in English translations sound the same to naive ears, Katz's critical agenda of emphasizing the religious plurality of mysticism insists that there are no mystical experiences as such. There are only Buddhists having Buddhist mystical experiences, Jews having Jewish ones, and Christians having uniquely Christian experiences. Other noteworthy essays in Katz's collection, Mysticism and Philosophical Analysis, include Peter Moore's Mystical Experience, Mystical Doctrine, Mystical Technique, which take somewhat of a milder position on the question of the relationship between language and experience, writing that mystics' doctrinal background should be seen as a key into their experience rather than a door which shuts us off from it, and puts forth a more nuanced model for the relationship between experience and interpretation, and despite being a short essay, lays out, in McGinn's opinion, an interesting and original program that would probably require a full book for its delineation. Other essays within the collection go even further than Katz, with Hans Penner, for example, explicitly dismissing mysticism as a false category, an essentialistic illusion. Mysticism, he writes, is a false category, unreal regardless of whether it's taken as the universal essence of religion or as a particular feature of a religious system. Ouch. In Schmidt's words, through the work of Katz and his colleagues, mysticism was returned to the conditioning webs of history, culture, and language. Religious experience was no more unmediated, unique, ineffable, or perennial than any other kind of experience. Katz's position has been called a form of mystical pluralism or nominalism, but is mostly either called contextualism or constructivism. The first more mild position, contextualism, referring to the fundamental belief in the inalienable relationship between a mystical experience and its socio-religious context, an approach which seeks to take into account the full linguistic, cultural, historical, and religious context of a mystical experience when attempting to interpret it. And the second, more acute position, constructivism, asserts that there are no unmediated pure experiences, that every mystical experience, like every other mental phenomena, is mediated through complexly coded linguistic, doctrinal, and cultural filters, the inherited theological mystical education, and the rules and patterns of one's discursive world that shape and construct the experience itself. Neither mystical experience nor more ordinary forms of experience give any indication or any grounds for believing that they are unmediated. That is to say, all experience is processed through, organized by, and makes itself available to us in extremely complex epistemological ways. Interpretation for the constructivist is not something that comes after the experience, as the purists had argued, but occurs rather before, during, and after any experience. It precedes, intercedes, and succeeds each and all experience. Interpretation and experience for the constructivists are inseparable from one another, like two friends that do not part. Katz and his colleagues were certainly not the first to raise such questions and critiques of the dominant common core narrative. Albert Schweitzer, R.C. Zehner, and Gershon Sholem all had raised their objections well before. Somewhat shockingly and prophetically, Rufus Jones, in his 1909 work Studies in Mystical Religion, writes, "Our language, our moral ideas, our human fashions are all what they are because of the conscious or unconscious influences of group suggestion." And continues to write, "But this experience," speaking of the mystical experience, "as soon as it is valued and appreciated, will show the influences of unconscious suggestion from the social environment. There are no pure experiences, i.e., no experiences which come wholly from beyond the person who has had them. The most refined mysticism," continues Rufus, "the most exalted spiritual experience is partly a product of the social and intellectual environment in which the personal life of the mystic has formed and matured. There are no experiences of any sort which are independent of performed expectations or unaffected by the prevailing beliefs of the time. Mystical experience will be perforce saturated with the dominant ideas of the group to which the mystic belongs, and they will reflect the expectations of the group and that period." This was written well before the advent of postmodernism and almost 70 years before Katz's essay, but for whatever reason, Katz's timing seems to have been just right, and his assault on the notion of a common core of mystical experience seems to have hit a nerve in contemporary philosophy of mysticism, and went on to dominate the subsequent philosophical discussion of mysticism in the English-speaking world for decades to come. Katz has received a tremendous amount of critical response from within the academic community, from those leading more progressively than Katz in a postmodern and postcolonial direction, accusing Katz of imposing Western epistemological standards on non-Western traditions, many of them which intentionally deconstruct stand-in Western models of consciousness, knowing, and the individual. They see Katz as telling these non-Western traditions what they can or can't claim based on Kantian epistemology, in which human knowledge is intimately structured by the a priori categories of the mind, and therefore cannot know the thing in itself, which these scholars see as an act of philosophical colonialization, effectively arguing that Katz's contextualist theory, which attempts to curtail mysticism, must itself be contextualized, and the constructivist position itself must be seen as constructed. From Katz's more obvious critics, the proponents of a perennial or common core interpretation of mysticism, some notable responses have been penned by Price, Perovich, Proudfoot, Evans, Smith, Stober, King, Studstill, and many others. I'll pop up a bunch on the screen so you can check them out if you'd like that. Magique. But the most sustained and wide-scale response has been led by Robert Foreman and his colleagues, although one may be wary of any correlation between quantity and quality here. Foreman, in a collection of essays of like-minded scholars, hypothesizes, in a line of thinking most reminiscent to Walter Stace's 1960 Mysticism and Philosophy, that if the mystical experience is an experience precisely devoid of any content whatsoever, a pure consciousness experience as he calls it, then we can in fact make valid cross-cultural comparisons. We can compare void with void, empty with empty, because there is nothing at all in the experience to be culturally conditioned, because there's nothing in it at all. A slightly underwhelming hypothesis, if you ask me, and a difficult one to square with the historical account of mysticism. You should read it and decide for yourself, however, as with all things. Katz has also been criticized for ignoring the extent to which mystical experiences and traditions might be shaped by our common neurophysiology and neuropsychology. Mystics, after all, despite living in different cultures and speaking different languages, share the same human organs, most notably the human brain, which a modern thinker like Katz would take as the locus and theater, if not generator, of human experience. There's also been some debate as to whether mystics typically confirm their traditions and function as conservative forces for preservation, or whether they are more often challenging their given traditions, functioning as disruptive forces for innovation and progress, a question posed mainly in relationship to religion, but which can also be posed for the realm of politics, as if those are two separate things. And secondly, whether the answer to that question of whether the mystic is progressive by nature or conservative and traditional by nature, whether that has any bearing on the perennialist constructivist debate. Constructivists claim that a mystic's given tradition will dictate not only their interpretation of their experience, but also the very experience itself, conditioning them with what to expect, hope for, and eventually see in their experience. And we can expect, therefore, for mystics to be rather orthodox and conservative in nature, and the pervading image of the mystic as a rebel, heretic, pioneer, transcending the particularity of their own religious tradition is a mistaken one born from an overemphasis of radical figures throughout history, precisely because of the perennialist agenda latent in the early scholarship. Such will argue the constructivists. Perennialists will argue that the mystic's ability to innovate, defy, or circumvent the tradition at all indicates a possible independence between experience, interpretation, and context. For if one's experiences are inherently socially constructed, how can one ever come up with anything new? And particularly anything that would challenge the religious context of the mystic. Constructivists respond in turn, just to show you how these arguments go, by arguing that whether a mystic's experience seems to be confirming or denying their tradition, they are in both cases responding to and in inseparable conversation with their tradition, making the question of the relative conservative or innovative nature of the mystic's experience a mute and unfalsifiable point. In Bernard McGinn's balanced scholarly opinion, these and other reactions to Katz's positions show that there are serious reasons for holding that this form of what might be called mystical nominalism, based on an unqualified contextualism, needs to be modified in the direction of a position that will both recognize the mediated aspects of all mystical experience and still not preclude the possibility of comparison, and calls for a more cautious and more adequate comparativism based on a qualified contextualism, and the need for an agreed-upon epistemology to build such a comparison upon. The impact of Katz's scholarship on the field is undeniable. Katz's methodological revolution has been challenged on a variety of grounds, writes Jeffrey Kripal. Nevertheless, Katz's epistemological shift of the discourse has permanently altered the field, rendering it far more sensitive to historical and religious context, and far more skeptical of essentialist positions. But I'm not interested here in just retelling the story of this debate for the sake of repeating it. If that was all that mattered, you can go on Wikipedia or 100 other places and read about it for yourself. The reason I presented the debate was because I wanted to take this opportunity to make a plea for us to move beyond this debate, to learn from the best of both sides, and continue to build as McGinn has called for. The academic study of mysticism, frankly, is at an impasse. As Still writes, the opposition between constructivism and essentialism has polarized the discourse. The philosophical discourse of mysticism has devolved into what appears to be an irresolvable debate between these two approaches, and while the scholarly output on both sides has been considerable, no one has been able to formulate an argument sufficiently compelling to persuade anyone but the already converted. The study of mysticism is at an impasse. We need to start directing our research and efforts away from showing how either side of the debate is mistaken. We need to instead learn from both sides. We need to be able to see both unity and difference. This is the basic function of any human perception and conception, to be able to both differentiate and see patterns of commonality, to effectively analyze and synthesize. Without this, we would very simply not be able to perceive or conceive of anything at all. Focusing only on unity will eradicate any vital points of particularity and distinction. It will create the night in which all colors are black, while focusing only on diversity will eradicate any common categories and groupings, and ultimately the subject matter itself. It is the blinding light in which there are only particles and waves, no colors at all. What we need is to see the colors of the reality. As with all things in life, is a fine balance, unity in diversity, diversity in unity, and maybe even identity in difference. Compromise happens not when we abdicate our positions, but when we're secure enough to see and take the best of what the other has to offer as well and incorporate it into our own. The return to the contextual study of mysticism has been the enduring legacy of Katz and his colleagues' work. We can no longer see mysticism as autonomous and self-contained, divorced from its context of culture, history, tradition, and discipline. The mystics now, once again, despite James, Addison, and Clarke, have both birth date and native land. They are embedded again in time and place, and that's a good thing. The perennialists, post-Katz, recognize the need for much more cautious perennialism, if we're to have one at all. Thinkers like Wayne Proudfoot, who straddle the debate, can be seen taking smaller steps towards a circumscribed common core. He writes, "There do seem to be expressions, experiential reports, and practices that are sufficiently similar across different traditions to warrant the use of the term mysticism and to bring our attention to some common characteristics." Some scholars point to specific themes which they find shared among various mystical traditions, or at least have a strong resemblance to one another, such as the belief in the possibility of the encounter, presence, participation, union, communion, or identity of the self or the true self with the true nature of or the ultimate ground of reality. Secondly, that the true nature of reality is non-dual or fundamentally unified beyond all dichotomies of time, space, subject and object, good and bad, language and logic. Another, the belief that this unity and truth cannot be communicated, namely it is ineffable, nor discovered discursively, but only through a direct experience or awakening of consciousness to this reality through a transformative process, which may incorporate a variety of practices, rituals, techniques, or disciplines, whereby the previous, egoic, separate conception of self and reality, a state of concealment, trance, sleep, or forgetfulness of our true nature, are dissolved, and new, unified, sometimes deified conceptions of the self and reality are reborn. The process by which the sense of separate self is lost and the unitive, the absolute, is found. A process which ideally leads to an increase in feelings of bliss and acceptance, selflessness, love, and compassion. This position taken by Houston Smith and others is that while another's experience is fundamentally inaccessible to us, and therefore should not be appealed to and is not worth arguing about or discussing at all, and that the language by which individual mystics will express themselves is going to be inevitably different and culturally dependent, the similarity, commonality, perhaps even unity of their truths, their core ideas, beliefs, and processes is, according to these scholars, unmistakable. In Celia Curie's assessment, the validity and value of an approach which emphasizes the very real need for contextualization of mysticism is to be lauded. A consideration of the religious specificity or different traditions and their conditional network is a sine qua non for any objective investigation. Curie goes on to argue for a wider ecumenicism of mysticism, which avoids both the claims of mystical autonomy or mystical sameness, a model which would enable mystical traditions to acknowledge their complementarity and articulate their plurality, and thus contribute a variegated yet global mystical consciousness, which is vitally important in this pluralistic era. We're waiting for the scholar up to the task to stand up and redeem the discipline, to save and redeem mysticism itself. Schmidt observes that already in 1915, Rufus Jones believed that he was living through, quote, a profound revival of interest in mysticism, but not a distinct revival of mysticism itself, despite the many seekers in all lands who were keen and eager for fresh truth and new light on mysticism. Previous revivals, Jones said, had been led by luminous mystics and first-hand prophets of mystical religion, but this one was led by mere scholars of mysticism, second-hand historians and psychologists, self-confessed outsiders like William James. Charles Addison shared this criticism, lamenting and bemoaning modern philosophical, theological, and psychological studies of mysticism as merely academic, and himself proposed to write on the theory of mysticism only as that may be of use in learning how to practice it, what he calls mysticism as an art. Feeling that the rest of the studies out there, including James's, were tremendously interesting, but tended rather to make more intelligent the criticism of mysticism than to make more mystics. Why then did we discuss all this? As we started by saying, we're under no impression that merely discussing mysticism even seriously, intelligently, and thoroughly is going to make any of us mystics if that's the goal that we're after. It may in reality only make us more astute critics of mysticism, as Addison observed. What then is the purpose of discussing the history, theory, methodology, scholarship, and development of mysticism? I can see at least 3 good reasons to read, think, and talk about mysticism. One, as we started by saying, is that if we're going to be talking about mysticism at all, we should at least do it intelligently, because there is so much unintelligent and unintelligible talk being spoken about around mysticism that it's time that we bring back some good scholarship, some grounded sources, that we can talk about this in an intelligent, rigorous, thorough, and persuasive way. Secondly, the practice of mysticism historically was never simply an experiential or ritualized enterprise. It was always comprised as well by a side of scholarship, of study, of theory, and that part of mysticism still, in excavating and exploring and explicating mysticism itself, can be seen as part of the tradition of mysticism itself, and not as something extraneous and separate from it. Kripal, Wasserstorm, and others have pointed out that these scholars of mysticism themselves were often mystics, thinly veiled by their scholarship, but really trying to get to the heart of an issue, albeit through the tools of academia and scholarship. And lastly, I think that as moderns, we don't always have a choice to approach these subjects firsthand. We don't have the luxury or the capacity to put aside our critical thinking, our rational minds, and simply dive headfirst into the mysteries of mysticism, although some may do that. Therefore, if we do feel compelled by the beauty, by the grandeur, by the promise that mysticism may hold, the only way which we can do that is as thinking, rational beings, bringing with us our skepticism, bringing with us our critical thought. And I'd like to welcome that. I would like to welcome you, if you are here, to join us on that study, on that program of exploring mysticism with our criticism and with our rationality, to understand mysticism not merely as an academic subject, as a butterfly pinned on the paper that's been long dead, but as something which is alive, something that may be reborn in you and in I, and hopefully, thoughtfully. Thank you for joining us, and keep seeking.